I remember in 2008 when I was in the last year of high school, and our school was going through the transition. It was took over by another school. The new school was setting up new things, new boards, bigger classrooms, and also half of the staff was let go and new teachers were being brought in. We were sad to see that Mr. Costa was going. He was one of the best Spanish teachers we had, and getting a new Spanish teacher was something we were all looking forward to. We had a little break from the school till then, and we waited for the call. And then the call came after the vacation we just had of the 10 days, and the first day, we went. We were pretty excited, especially for our teacher. Our new Spanish teacher, we heard that she was some pretty teacher we would have. Some of them said that she was one of those Playboy girls, and some even said that she was the sexy nun from those weird Italian movies. I wasn't sure about it. Kids made all kinds of stories that you shouldn't really believe in. Then the moment came. It was our Spanish class. We were all waiting for the teacher to come in the class, and I remember the look on everyone's face. Kids were excited. There were already talks about the new teacher in the school, but it was our class that was the first one to catch a complete glimpse of her. And we remember even the male teachers were rounding up near our class, making appearances again and again, asking if the teacher had come in yet. And well, after about 15 minutes, she appeared. And when she appeared, I remember everybody was wide and staring. She was everything that the students were talking about. And I saw her, and I remember she was like a goddess. And I was looking at her and getting really mesmerized by the way she looked. And then the things just escalated too quickly. Then it can. She shouted at us, calling us idiots in Spanish, and told us to take out our books. When we did, she asked us questions. And as everyone failed, she would call us stupid. She was curvy. And every time she talked, her whole body would move, and the boys were constantly using that as an excuse to make it jiggle, and she was angry at it. And then she asked a girl to stand up and asked her. The girl said that what she asked was a wrong question, and then they spiraled into a long argument in Spanish. And as the teacher got angrier, her cleavage was getting obscure and visible to the boys who were having the fun with the argument. And then there was a lot of cheer involved, and the frustration was pretty visible on her face, and it was visible on the girl's face too, while all the classroom boys sat and cheered for the new teacher. I believe there was no way to assess where the situation was heading out to. Our class was completely nuanced, and it was the first day for the Spanish teacher, and she was already losing her shit to the bunch of no-good students. I remember seeing her so frustrated with the arguments and the boys shouting that it felt like she wanted to murder us all. And as I looked at her, I saw her moving back to her new improved desk and picked up the big fat Spanish book. And I wondered if she was going to point out the mistakes of the girl. But as she got back, I was witnessing irrational rage blinding a capable and reliable adult into complete irrational, illogical, and dangerous individual who was in charge of handling the students. She picked the book, walked towards the girl. The girl who was arguing with the teacher was Maria. Her father was Spanish. Basically, Spanish was her first language, and she even had a good command of it, and it wasn't the first time that she pointed out the mistake. She did that before with the previous teacher, and he even applauded her for that. And to me, that is why he's a great teacher, because he admitted when he was wrong and was not afraid of owning up to his mistake. And Maria was one of those prodigal geniuses, so there was no doubt that she wasn't wrong. She was thin and small with glasses over her face, and she was very stern when it came to academic stuff. So I was already rooting Maria's side. And while the whole class knew that Maria was right, it was the new voluptuous Spanish teacher and the boys were cheering for, and for a completely different thing. And as she held the big fat Spanish book in her hand, she came near to Maria. Now the book was a hardcover book, and she caught close to Maria and took the book and smacked it around her face and shouted, "Don't ever fucking dare to raise your goddamn voice in front of me. I will make sure you never get to next grade." And in that moment, the whole class went quiet. There was nothing. But then soon, it was followed by Maria shouting. The glasses she was wearing had glass broken, and that pierced her eyes. And when she got hit, the glasses pierced her eyes, and she was bleeding profusely by her eyes. And moments later, she was unconscious. We remembered the teacher freaking out and ran out of the class. We had no idea what to do, and kids were shouting when the teachers came in and saw what happened. And just minutes later, the whole class was surrounded by police and ambulance, and everybody was just in panic. and the new management of the school had one hell of the first day, and they were panicking. And when the school got surrounded by the parents, things just went off the rails. Even media was quick to get there, and people were freaking out and out for the blood of the hot-looking sinister teacher and the management who hired her without the background check or the demo supervision. While people were looking for answers and blaming the school management, they completely let go the real culprit. She was never found again by the police. But wherever she is, I am pretty sure she is causing havoc.
When I was 18, I worked at my college's residence building at the front desk, and I think I almost got assaulted or murdered. But you be the judge of that. During the summer, the building operated as a hotel. So 2.5 floors were hotel rooms, and half of the 3rd floor were student housing. The whole building operated with a hotel swipe key system that was pretty outdated, and all the doors were powered by 4 AA batteries. If the batteries died, there was a decently lengthy process to replace them and reprogram the door. A dark-haired guy came to the front desk from inside the building, while I was working an overnight shift at around 1 or 2 a.m., and said he'd left his keycard in his room. I made him a new one and made my first error of the night. Hotel guests could have as many room keys remade as they wanted, hypothetically. But students, however, were supposed to be given a temporary keycard and charged $2 to be returned when theirs is located. I gave him a new key for his room and asked if he was a student or a hotel guest, and he replied, student. At this point, I should have checked our system to charge his account, but I was caught up doing administrative duties and forgot. I used to trust people way too easily at this job, but quickly learned not to. Later on in the night, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m., he came to the desk again and said he couldn't get into his room. I asked if he'd forgotten his key again, and he said no, the door wasn't working. I asked if the light was coming on when he swiped his card, and he said no, so I figured the batteries were dead. I told him I'd have to change the batteries, and I went up to his room with him, and he asked me for my name, and I told him. But he didn't tell me his. I opened the room door manually with a master key, and told him I'd have to prop it open while I worked on the back panel to replace the batteries. No, it's okay, I'll close it, he said, and closed and deadbolted the door locked. Really weird, but I tried not to think about it. I had changed the batteries on plenty of other doors by this point, and some students were iffy about having their doors propped open for their room to be on display for anyone walking by. He also had a really thick accent, and I thought he might be an international student, since we had a lot of them from other countries where their English was not their first language. I gave him the benefit of the doubt and thought maybe it was also just a language barrier issue. At this point, though, I really felt like something was wrong, but I tried to ignore it so I didn't freak him out. While I was trying to focus on fixing the door as quickly as possible, he kept trying to entice me to go further into the room, saying his bed was broken and he needed me to take a look at it, and that there was something underneath it that needed to be fixed, etc. He held out a little gold house key and said, "I have a key, go get it," and then threw it under the bed. He said there was a leak under the fridge. He just kept trying to get me down on the ground, throwing random problems at me. Obviously, I told him no. I'd send maintenance up in the morning to take a look if anything was broken. I had my back to him, and he asked me if I would take off my glasses. I said no, I need them to see. His tone of voice changed then, and in the most steady, chilling manner he said, "Ella, it's okay, you can take them off." Then from behind me he reached around and tried to take off my glasses. I swatted his hand away, and in trying to remain composure said no thanks, I need to keep them on. Even though he was creeping me the hell out, I didn't want to be rude to him, and I didn't want to get in trouble if he'd complained about me, or risk upsetting him and having him yell at me. I got up to grab something from the door repair kit, and undid the door deadbolt and opened it up in the process. He then jumped towards the door to close it again and told me to keep it closed. I told him no, I had to open it to start reprogramming it from the front. While I held the door open with my foot and grabbed something from the door repair kit, he started playing with the little wispy hairs at the top of my forehead and trying to touch my shoulder. I swatted him away again and asked him not to touch me and focused on getting the hell out of there. But once again he tried to get me to follow him into the bedroom, saying the bed was broken, and I went as far as the doorframe to see if I could spot any actual problem with his bed. This is when I realized that he had nothing in his room. No dishes in the kitchen, no shower curtain in the bathroom, no sheets on the bed, nothing. This wasn't his room. My brain once again went back to the international student theory, thinking he had just arrived today and hadn't gotten a chance to buy anything yet. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was wrong. I fiddled around with the door for a few more seconds before announcing that it was fixed, and quickly gathered the door kit and left. Before I had reached the elevator, he came back out with his shoes on to follow me. He tried to get back in to get his shoes and called out, "Ella, the door isn't fixed, you need to come back." I went back and opened the door manually, and told him if the door was broken I'd have to send up maintenance to fix it in the morning. I knew he was going to follow me to the elevator again, so I closed the door behind me once he'd gone inside and ran down the stairwell as fast as I could. When I got to the front desk, I checked the computer and saw that the room that he was in was supposed to be empty. It wasn't a student room or a hotel room. I locked myself in our back office and called campus security. He came down a few minutes later and went behind the desk. I yelled at him to get on the other side and wait, now that I knew he wasn't a resident. He tore the corner off a slip of paper I had sitting on the desk and drew a flower on it, then put it back on top of my papers. When security arrived, he ran back up to the empty room and tried convincing them he lived there so he wouldn't have to leave. He kept showing them his key, which had decided to work on the door again somehow, and they escorted him back downstairs and came to ask me if he really did live there. Obviously he didn't. That's why I called you guys, crying and terrified. He kept interjecting to argue that he did live there, but couldn't even recall his room number when asked. Security asked him for his student card, and he couldn't produce it, so they told him he would have to leave if he couldn't prove he lived there. While they were grabbing his information, I listened from the office and could immediately tell he was lying. The phone number he gave was just a bunch of random numbers. The name he gave was prefixed by, as if he was trying to think of a name. When they asked him for his address, he just said, across the street. One security guard asked if he lived in the apartments across the street, and he said yes, but couldn't tell them what the building number was. He said his apartment number was 1200, but I moved into that building a few months later, and apartment 1200 doesn't exist. When security asked what his purpose was to be sneaking into a room, he just kept up the ums and uhs, and saying he didn't know. They'd ask, "Were you trying to see a friend? Do you know anybody who lives here? Were you here to hurt somebody?" And he kept fidgeting and saying, "I don't know. No reason. I was just here." At one point he tried to tell them he was my friend, which is when I poked my head out of the office to say that I literally had never seen him before that night. He eventually left. We didn't call the police because he didn't actually do anything, but it was still unsettling. Later on it dawned on me how he'd figured out that that room was vacant. One of the housekeepers had been using it as her personal break room. A few days later, a housekeeper came to the desk and told me they'd found the door deadbolted open, the TV on, and a housekeeper inside watching TV. She must have forgotten to close the door when she left for the night, and when the creep let himself into the building, he found it. I never saw him again, and to this day I have no clue what he was doing there. I haven't worked there since last winter, and overnight shifts still give me the heebie-jeebies.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
The morning of September 23, 1904 was marked by gray, ominous clouds that blanketed the skies of Cincinnati, Ohio. And it was raining at around 10:15 a.m. when the principal of Pleasant Ridge School, Thomas L. Zimmerman, rang the bell for morning recess. Zimmerman figured a little rain wouldn't do the children any harm, as they scattered into groups and began games of baseball and partook in general tomfoolery. But the principal had seriously misjudged how fast and how strong the rain would come. And not just the rain either. A full-on storm was quickly approaching. A few minutes later, the wind picked up while a heavy rain began to fall on the schoolyard. Most of the children ran for the school building to save themselves from being soaked through, but a group of about 30 young girls made a break for the outhouse on the opposite side of the schoolyard. The outhouse was a 10-foot square framed building positioned over a 12-foot deep stone vault on the eastern side of the schoolyard. It was only 11 years old, but had to be repaired several times because of shoddy construction. It was designed for maybe only a handful of students at any one time, but on that day, just over 30 young girls were trying to squeeze into the cramped, dank space. Suddenly, and without warning, the floor on one side of the building, rotten from years of moisture, gave way, and the entire floor of the privy crashed to the bottom of the vault, taking all 30 or so of the terrified young women with it. The floor fell almost 8 feet vertically and completely shattered, sending children as young as 7 into a huge pool of sewage water that was around 4 feet deep. There was no crash at all, 12-year-old Elsie Ferguson later said. There was no noise whatsoever, the floor just fell. That's all there was to it. Not a child scream that I'd heard. I felt the floor going and jumped quickly, clutching to the side of the door. I was left hanging on it, and with all my strength I pulled myself up and out of that place. A handful of the other girls managed to escape the same way, climbing up onto the toilet seat to make room for the others before making it to a doorway. But not all were so fortunate. Raw panic ensued, and the tragic accident quickly became a battle for their lives. The girls were unwittingly pitted against each other in a struggle for survival as they tried to climb out of the 4-foot-deep pool of human excrement, with the weaker girls crushed down by the stronger peers as they were forced under to drown in the mass of filth. You see, a mass drowning is perhaps one of the darkest, most horrifying things a person can experience, because during a panic like that, survival mechanics in the human brain kick in, and a person will find any kind of leverage at all to stay above water. This means that people will literally drag each other underwater, climbing atop each other's drowning bodies in order to stay afloat in breathing air. And this is exactly what happened during the tragedy that day. Girls were actually drowning each other in a desperate bid to stay alive. A young woman by the name of Lorena Ferguson was rushing into the outhouse just moments after the floor gave way, stopping dead in her tracks when she saw the horrific scene below. Seconds later, she turned on her heels and ran back into the schoolhouse to fetch help. A few minutes later, 2 of the girls ran into the room and exclaimed that a girl had fallen into the vault. Principal Zimmerman later told a local newspaper, "I didn't realize the awful calamity that had overcome us, but hurried in the direction of the outbuilding. On the way, I met a number of others. They were screaming wildly at the top of their voices, and it was some time before one of them could compose herself sufficiently to explain what had happened. Another young woman ran to one of the high school classrooms, which was still in session, and alerted one of the teachers there of the outhouse's collapse. Then she and 4 high school boys bolted toward the outhouse, arriving at roughly the same time as Principal Zimmerman. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover. The sight of terrified young women scrambling up the walls of the collapsed outhouse, covered in human filth, was almost too much to bear. Others further down were literally swimming in week-old fecal matter, struggling to keep their head above the mass of excrement. The sight alone was bad enough, but the cacophony of screams was almost deafening. All of the girls were screeching at the top of their lungs, their cries intermittent with the sounds of gagging and retching. 2 young men were across the street in the Presbyterian church with a few others when they heard the terrified screeching of the girls running away from the outhouse in the pouring rain. As they exited the church to see what all the commotion was about, they began to hear the faint screams of the girls trapped in the vault beneath the outhouse. They heard the desperate screams of "Mama, Papa, help us." Then, without as much as a word between them, the occupants of the church ran out into the rain and over to the girls' outhouse. There they found Principal Zimmerman, standing in a narrow doorway to the outhouse, looking half mad with anguish, pale with panic and unsure what to do. The men shoved him aside and got to work. They began calling out to any nearby to fetch ropes and ladders, anything that could help them fish the girls out from the pile of human waste. Zimmerman himself dropped to the ground near the open doorway, trying as best he could to reach some of the girls with just his arm, but it was impossible. They were way out of reach. Then some of the men who ran to help grabbed him by the legs and lowered him further down into the recess. This helped him rescue 3 of the girls before any rescue equipment even arrived, and probably saved the man a lifetime of guilt in the process, given that he had panicked so awfully in the initial stages of the rescue attempt. Especially given that the step ladders brought over for the school were far too short, and the ropes brought over were nothing but clotheslines which snapped uselessly as the girls attempted to climb up them. While I was waiting for a longer ladder, Zimmerman later said, I begged the children to be quiet and brave, and I would rescue them. Some of the older girls followed his commands, attempted to calm the younger ones, but it was no good. Panic had well and truly taken hold. The ladders and clotheslines repeatedly failed, and the rescuers were forced to rethink their strategy. Using quick thinking, one of the men climbed into the steeple of the nearby church and unfurled the rope off the church bell. This was much more effective a tool and helped save the lives of 2 more of the girls. Another one of the rescuers found a long ladder in a nearby barn and helped Principal Zimmerman dip it into the muck. It was not long enough to reach all the way from the bottom of the vault, but it was long enough for Zimmerman and some of the other men to descend and lift the girls out of the mess. The girls that were pulled out of the mess were almost unrecognizable. Their eyes clenched tightly shut as they wept hysterically, gasping for breath and trying to uselessly clean the stinking waste off themselves. The struggle down there was terrible, said a survivor named Hazel Senior in the aftermath of the disaster. As long as I could get out of the water and take a breath of air, I felt sure of being saved. But when I fell back into the hole, I thought it was over. The girls about me were grabbing onto me. Everyone grabbed at each other, and when we did get a hold on the wall, it was only for a second. I caught hold several times, but when I was pulled at by the others, my hand slipped. There was only a few taken out when I felt something under my feet. It must have been some little girl that had drowned. All the time I prayed. I said my prayers over and over. I could not see after a while, and as I was praying to the Lord to save me, I found the rake in my hands. When I came into the light, I saw Principal Zimmerman. I crawled up and was lifted out. After struggling in the violent frenzy among the pit of disgusting fecal matter, 14-year-old Edna Gerke again found a purchase among the brickwork and made one final attempt to pull herself out. Far above me, it seemed somebody was coming down a ladder and called to me. Suddenly, someone took hold of me. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the agonized faces of my friends, then lost consciousness and knew no more until I woke up in the schoolroom, surrounded by the bodies of my friends. Gerke's arms were horribly bruised and torn up by deep scratches. Wounds, she said, were down to the clawing attempts of her classmates to climb over her out of the stinking mess of filth. The rainstorm ceased not long after, but the break in the weather did little to relieve the chaos that was unfolding on the schoolyard. A fair few of the girls passed out not long after emerging from the sewage, adding the fear that they had succumbed to the terrible fumes of the cesspit they had fallen into. But thankfully, neighbors of the school offered up their homes as treatment centers, with rescuers carrying girls to the safety of houses where they were revived, cleaned up, and comforted after such a harrowing ordeal. After Zimmerman helped the 19th and final girl off the ladder and watched other rescuers carry her away into the schoolhouse for treatment, he leaned inside the shattered outhouse and peered into the dark, silent cesspit. All he could see were broken pieces of outhouse floor floating around in the surface of the foul water. As he realized the task was over and the adrenaline began to fade, he could have easily fallen into the cesspit himself if it wasn't for other rescuers coming to check on him. But then it was early afternoon, and the sun had finally broken through the clouds, shedding an oddly warm light on such a horrific scene of chaos, filth, and death. The gathered mass of onlookers and rescuers doubled as relatives began streaming in from downtown Cincinnati. It had taken only an hour or so for word-of-mouth accounts of the fatal collapse to reach the wider citizenry. When they heard the news, Pleasant Ridge residents who happened to be working downtown ran back to the village, where they were met with the sight of the frantic children and mothers of the victims, who were congregated in the front of the school. Many of the girls were vomiting blood, and a local doctor in attendance was not sure if they would survive the afternoon. Frantic confusion continued for several more hours as more and more people arrived from nearby villages, although most of the girls who crammed into the privy lived in Pleasant Ridge. The routes between the school and the train stations were crammed with people. The village telephone system proved inadequate to keep up with the demand, and hundreds of people crowded around every available phone, waiting to find if their daughter was among those affected. When the adrenaline rush of the rescue abated, Principal Zimmerman and his teachers sobbed along with the parents who lost their daughters. Local medical staff looked at the exhausted and emotionally distraught principal and ordered him to a house across the street to rest. One of the doctors remained there the remainder of the afternoon, suffering from a severe headache brought on by the tension and the hours he spent inhaling the noxious fumes emitted from the caked bodies of the drowned girls. On the Sunday morning of the drowned girls' funeral, every church bell in Pleasant Ridge rang continuously from 9 a.m. when the first funeral started until 4 p.m. when the last of the 4 girls buried that day were put to rest. 4 school friends of Emma Steinkamp, the first victim to be buried, had been tapped to be her pallbearers. The girls were bearing flowers dressed in white as they walked alongside, but after carrying the tiny casket to the front of the German Evangelical Church, they were too grief-stricken to carry on any further, so 4 local boys took over instead. The reverend of the Methodist Church tried to calm the sobbing crowd, but one grandmother fell weeping against the small casket, and Emma's mother fainted with a deafening shriek. At that point, 2 of the girls in white became hysterical and their parents carried them from the scene. The entire town and a fair portion of the rest of Cincinnati followed the hearse to the cemetery. It had been the most horrifying, revolting tragedy in the entirety of Cincinnati's recent history, one that the townsfolk would never forget. And the deaths were made all the more terrible by the fact that they had occurred in a pit of human sewage, a fate that no single person could ever deserve, let alone an innocent young girl.